Hello, this is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. I have the word Copernicus written here on the board. I want to talk about him very briefly. Copernicus is oftentimes looked to as this great figure that takes us out of the Middle Ages and takes us out of, rule by the church into science, wonderful science. And of course, we shouldn't read it this simply. This is all very complicated. I've always read the so-called conflict between Copernicus and Galileo and the church, if you will, rather as a conflict between the old science and the new science. Of course, a lot of the old science was right in the church, see? So it's not necessarily a conflict between religion and science. You've got to be very careful with this. We hear a lot these days from a few, and the new atheists, if you will, a rabid crowd, who make these historical generalizations and seem to think that everybody that was religious was an idiot, and then science came along and it was wonderful. And of course, history is much more complicated than that. A lot of good science done by religious people. In fact, all of the new science was done basically by people of faith. And really, just think about it. To unpack the regularity of nature, well, why would nature be regular? Well, because it's the artifact of a divine creator with reason, right? So, stuff is much more complicated than sometimes we see, particularly in media outlets these days. Copernicus, of course, uses Ptolemy's data. And the Ptolemaic system, if you will, there was the Earth, right? And the planets moved around in these epicycles. And you had to have this epicycles like this to save the appearance, right? To save the empirical observation. It could be made consistent if we posited that there was this epicycles of the heavenly bodies going around the Earth. Well, Copernicus could actually read Aristarchus. You're saying, well, who is Aristarchus? Well, Aristarchus, of course, was the progenitor of the heliocentric hypothesis in ancient times, right? He was from Samos, and Copernicus could read Aristarchus, and he was impressed by Aristarchus's view. That, of course, the sun was at the center of things, and the other bodies went around it. This is the so-called heliocentric hypothesis over and against the geocentric hypothesis that had gone before. Copernicus was, as was Kepler, and maybe even Galileo to some degree, there was, some strong Neoplatonic and Neo-Pythagorean tendencies, well, particularly in Copernicus and Kepler. Number was a very important category, right? And Copernicus would have understood something like the harmony of the spheres, going way back to our good friend Pythagoras, that there is an order of things, and indeed the cosmos sings to the glory of God in some ways, right? Copernicus writes in his great book, in the center of it all rests the sun. For who would place this lamp of a very beautiful temple in another or better place than where from it can illuminate everything at the same time, right? Makes sense to have it at the center. As a matter of fact, not unhappily do some call it the lantern, others the mind, and still others the pilot of the world. Trismegistus calls it the visible God. So anyway, it's probably hard for us to realize what a profound effect the heliocentric hypothesis had, because, of course, we, coming out of the Middle Ages, we could easily have this view of thing, the so-called three-tiered cosmos, right? Hell down below, right? And then here's the Earth, and heaven above, right? And in earth, there is this very dramatic voyage that we're all on that does not end in earth, but it ends either in the celestial city of heaven or in the fiery pits of hell. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty meaningful existence if you walk around thinking that all the time, right? It's pretty meaningful. Might be a little scary, but it's meaningful. Well, of course, in the heavens was the sun. I mean, this view of things you could see to be quite consistent with the three-story universe. The three-story universe could be made consistent with a geocentric view of things. But the heliocentric view becomes more difficult. Okay, we have the Renaissance, right? This is a pretty big thing happening. The rise of humanism, and of course Luther was influenced by humanism. Humanism went back and studied the texts, the ancient texts. They tried to go back and find out what these thinkers thought, right? And tried to return ad fontes to the source of things. Well, I'm not going to talk about the Renaissance and humanism in any great depth here, but just to note that at this time we have the rise of the notion of sovereignty. And we have a thinker, Bodin, who lived from 1510 to 1596. He argued that the best way for a state to organize is to have power concentrated in a sovereign. A state should have one religion, he writes, which acts as the glue of that state. Otherwise, there will be discord. While the will and the power of the sovereign grounds law in the land, right, the sovereign must do God's will. So this idea of the state with a leader at the top of the state, you know, ruling by divine will, very important development. In Italy, especially, a new man develops who looks at the world naturalistically and tends to separate Bodin's notion of sovereignty from his moralism, because, of course, Bodin, moral guy. Machiavelli, maybe not quite so much, right? Machiavelli, yeah, let's see, I gotta remember how to pronounce that. Of course, this guy is 1510 to 1596, but then he died, and then Machiavelli, 1469, I believe, to 1527, right? Everybody's Googling that. Machiavelli had already given the classical expression of naturalistic sovereignty. He says, you know, virtue is that which promotes power, and vice is that which decreases it. What is religion for? Well, religion is used and can be used as the way of attaining and sustaining power. So now religion isn't an end in itself, but it is a means to another end. Okay, in humanism, of course, Petrarch lived from, I think, 13. Now, this is actually earlier, so why am I doing it now? Well, obviously I'm not organized. He argued that one must revive pagan learning and enjoy nature in itself. Petrarch develops this notion of documents as things to be studied in themselves, natural objects, and thus worthy of objective study. He develops a new conception of value. Human beings are autonomous, independent, rational beings. Value is to be found in this world, not the other. This is all marks of humanism and Renaissance underpinnings their value system. Humanistic education should be undertaken and the values of classical antiquity cultivated. I'll stop right there. I'll be right back with some major scientific developments in the 16th century. So you don't want to miss that. This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology.